Hello, friends. Thank you for being with me. Subscribe, like, and let's get started.
At first glance, they seemed like the perfect couple. Neighbors from neighboring apartments noticed how smoothly and calmly their life together was flowing. Employees who knew them at work admired how they managed to combine career and marriage without apparent conflicts. There were no loud scandals or stormy reconciliations in this family. Their life seemed to go according to a clearly planned plan. David was a man of iron discipline. Every morning started with coffee brewed at 6:30 sharp and a 30-minute jog around the block. His shirts were always perfectly pressed, and his documents were neatly folded on the desk in his office. Even in conversations, he was brief and very clear, avoiding unnecessary emotions. Why waste time on unnecessary words? He often told his colleagues, receiving their tacit approval. Sarah, his wife, was the exact opposite. Her day started depending on her mood, sometimes at 7 a.m., sometimes closer to 9. She loved music that played too loud, even in the morning. On her kitchen table, there could be a cup of half-drunk tea next to a messy stack of magazines. Her spontaneity amazed her friends, especially when she could suddenly suggest going to a nearby town for what she thought was the best croissant. And yet they somehow complemented each other. Sarah liked that David was an anchor in her life, a man who always knew what to do. She could return home after a walk with her friends and be sure that everything would be calm at home, without surprises. And David, as he once confessed to a friend, was impressed by her lightness. "She's like the wind," he said then. "It never occurred to me that I needed something like this in my life, but it works." However, their life was not as simple as it seemed to others. David had his own expectations. He is used to order not only in things, but also in relationships. He had a peculiar code. No ambiguities, no what if. Everything should be logical, predictable, and under control. Sarah, on the other hand, sometimes looked at these rules with slight disdain. It wasn't that she ignored them, but her spontaneity sometimes crossed boundaries. One morning, before dawn, Sarah suddenly began sorting through the books on the shelf in the living room, noisily pulling out volume after volume. David, who was adjusting his tie in front of the mirror at the time, turned around. "What is it?" he asked, frowning. "I remembered that my old diary is lying here somewhere," she said, without looking up from her search. "I want to find him. I wonder what I wrote 10 years ago. Don't you think this is a bad time to do this?" David said dryly, "I have a meeting in half an hour, and you're going to make noise while I'm trying to concentrate." Sarah grinned and froze for a moment, turning to him. "Well, I'm sorry. I just thought it would be useful for you to learn how to ignore background sounds." She continued her search, and he shrugged and returned to the mirror. There were few such moments, but they left David with a strange feeling, as if something was breaking the perfectly built symmetry of his life. Their harmony, which was seen by others, was fragile. It was based on unspoken agreements, mutual respect for personal space, and a strange combination of opposites. But small cracks have already begun to appear in this harmony. David didn't notice them, and Sarah tried to ignore them. As long as everything continued to go the usual way, no one asked unnecessary questions. Their shared decision to give up children was not impulsive or accidental. It has been brewing for years, gradually, like a quiet wave that is imperceptibly approaching the shore. David has always been a man accustomed to clarity and control, and the question of children for him has never been a question of if, rather, when to give up this idea completely. That evening, when the conversation took place, they were sitting on the terrace of their favorite restaurant. A light wind fluttered the tablecloths, carrying away the crumbs of fresh bread. Sarah, as always, flipped through the menu, although she knew it by heart, pretending to choose something new. David was sitting across from her, holding a glass of water in his hands, and thinking about tomorrow's meeting. "Have you ever thought that children only make life more difficult?" "What is it?" he asked suddenly. Sarah looked up from the menu, surprised by the suddenness of the question. "You've never talked about it," she said, putting the food map aside. "I've just been thinking about it lately," David began, leaning back in his chair. "We have plans. We have freedom. And the children, they require time, energy, and a complete lifestyle change. Isn't this the opposite of what we're building?" Sarah was looking at her husband intently. Her face remained calm, but her eyes showed the intense work of her thoughts. "I'm thinking." "You're right," she finally said, not looking away. David, clearly not expecting such a quick agreement, put the glass down on the table. "Really? What is it?" he asked, not hiding his surprise. "Yes. I've never seen myself as a mother. This is not what I dreamed of," Sarah shrugged, adding, "You and I work so well as a couple. I don't want anything to change us." He nodded, relieved. A conversation that could have become an argument turned into unexpected harmony. A week later, he was already sitting in the urologist's office explaining his decision. The doctor, a middle-aged man with a faded tie, looked at him over the top of his glasses. "Are you sure?" "What is it?" he asked, making notes on the map. "Absolutely," David replied without batting an eye. "Does the wife agree?" The doctor clarified, to which David only nodded. The procedure was scheduled for the end of next week. Sarah accompanied him to the clinic, although David assured her that he would manage on his own. She even joked, "If anyone can handle this without emotion, it's you." David smiled, but said nothing. It was their tacit agreement. They weren't being dramatic. After the procedure, David returned home earlier than usual. Sarah, who was sitting on the couch with her laptop, put it aside when she heard the front door slam. "Well, how is it?" "What is it?" she asked, meeting him in the hallway. "Everything went smoothly," he replied, taking off his jacket. "No surprises." Sarah chuckled, hugging him by the shoulders. "You see? Now we don't have any ifs. Just you and me." For a moment, her words seemed strange to him, as if they had a hidden subtext. But David didn't think much of it. That night, David lay in bed listening to Sarah tossing and turning next to him. She always fell asleep first, but today her breathing remained uneven. He didn't say anything, but his thoughts revolved around one question. Were they both equally confident in their decision? It all started unnoticed, with small changes that at first glance did not seem significant. Sarah began to stay late at work more often. At first, she warned about this in advance, leaving short messages. "I'll be late today. A project with colleagues." David, absorbed in his work, did not pay much attention to this. He understood that her position required her to recycle. One evening, he was sitting in his office, sorting papers, when the phone vibrated on his desk. A message from Sarah. "I'm late again. Don't wait for me to have dinner." He glanced at his watch. 9:15 p.m. Nothing unusual, he thought. Such situations have happened before. But gradually these delays became more frequent. Now she returned home after midnight, explaining this by team building or late meetings with the team. David didn't like unnecessary questions, but he began to notice that her explanations began to sound monotonous. "We just had a couple of cocktails with colleagues," she said one day, entering the apartment with a slight smell of alcohol. Her voice was cheerful, her face was flushed, and there was a familiar smile on her lips. David lifted his head from the monitor and looked at her. "Do you really like it?" he asked. "What is it exactly?" She took off her coat and threw it on a chair. "These team building. You've never done them before." Sarah shrugged, heading for the kitchen counter. "The new manager decided that we need to communicate more outside the office. Honestly, it's funny. People behave completely differently when they relax." David nodded and went back to his computer. But her words didn't calm him down. He wasn't a man who was easily suspicious, but there was something about her behavior that made you think. The next week, Sarah came in late again. He was already asleep when he heard the door slam. The clock showed 1:37. David propped himself up on his elbow and heard Sarah creeping quietly into the bathroom. He lay in the dark, listening to the sound of the water, and then the sound of her footsteps when she returned to the bedroom. "She came back late," he muttered. "We had dinner at the new bar," she replied, quickly crawling under the covers. "What kind of bar?" She hesitated for a moment. "I don't remember the name," she said casually. "Something like Garden or Vista." He felt slightly annoyed, but did not continue the conversation. The next day, he decided to do something that had never occurred to him before. David went to her work on the pretext that he wanted to meet her and go out to dinner together. He went into the office, where she was not. Sarah left earlier, one of her colleagues said as he ran past. David felt something shrink inside him. He didn't know what to think, but he decided to call her. The phone didn't answer for a long time, until finally he heard her voice. "Hi, David. Everything is fine? Where are you?" "In the office," she replied quickly. "I was just there," he said coldly. The pause on the other end lasted a little longer than necessary. You probably didn't notice. I was in the conference room." His lips tightened into a thin line. "I'll see you at home," he said, interrupting the call. When she returned in the evening, he tried to behave as usual, but there was concern in her eyes. She was no longer the woman who answered his questions with carefree confidence. Sarah was hiding something, and David could feel it. Now her team building became a topic that increasingly overshadowed their lives. David was sitting in his home library, trying to focus on the report he was supposed to send in the morning. The silence in the house, usually soothing, now irritated him. Sarah was out of the house again, and his mind was wandering, despite his efforts to focus on the numbers. It was 1:22 a.m. when he heard the front door open. Sarah staggered into the house. She was wearing a long coat that she hadn't buttoned up and high-heeled shoes that had clearly endured a difficult evening. Her hair was disheveled, and there were traces of worn makeup on her face. She tried to close the door, but slammed it too loudly, which immediately attracted his attention. "Sarah?" David went out into the hallway, barely hiding his irritation. She raised her head. An unnatural smile stretched across her face. "Hello, my love," she drawled. "You're drunk," he stated dryly, crossing his arms over his chest. "A little." Sarah waved her hand, barely able to stand on her feet. She tried to take off her shoes, but lost her balance and grabbed the wall. David took a step towards her to help, but suddenly something strange caught his attention. Something small fell to the floor at her feet, curled into a ball. In the dim light of the hallway, he did not immediately understand what it was, but stepped closer and picked up the object. It was a used condom. "What is that?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, but with such intensity that Sarah immediately tensed. She looked at his hand and tried to say something, but stopped, as if she couldn't find the words. Her face contorted for a moment. Then she abruptly turned away. "Have you been following me?" she suddenly shouted, without waiting for an answer to the first question. "What?" David felt rage rising in his chest. "Are you saying it's my fault? You brought this home, Sarah?" She turned to face him, her eyes glistening with alcohol and anger. I do not know how it ended up here," she shouted, but her voice sounded too loud, too unnatural. "Are you saying it was an accident?" David stepped closer, clutching the proof in his hand. "Explain to me then, how did this accidentally fall out of you?" Sarah took a step back, bumping into a wall. Her gaze darted around the room as if she was looking for a way out. Then she leaned forward sharply, her face contorted with malice. "You have no idea what I've been through, David," she shouted, raising her hand. "Do you know what happens when you work too hard? People start looking for attention on the side. Maybe it happened to me, but only because you're always cold." Her words hit him like a slap in the face. He froze, unable to believe that she was trying to shift the blame onto him. "Cold," he whispered, gritting his teeth. "Do you really think that justifies what you did?" Sarah leaned closer, her face just inches from his. "Or maybe you want me to infect you with something," she said with a venomous smile. David recoiled, as if her words could really hurt him physically. "What do you mean by that?" His voice was cold and clear. "You should thank me for taking care of myself. Or do you want to remember me every time you go to the doctor?" she said with a strange triumph in her voice. Those words finally broke something inside him. He was silent for a few seconds, looking at her, trying to make sense of what he had heard. "Get out," he said softly, but his tone was so firm that Sarah froze. "What?" she whispered, trying to hear. "I said get out of this house, Sarah. Right now." His voice was getting louder with every word. She took a step back, her eyes wide. "You can't kick me out. We're a family, David. It was just that a moment of weakness." "A moment of weakness?" David raised his hand, still clutching the condom. "Is this your moment of weakness? You don't live in this house anymore. Pack your things and get out of here." Sarah tried to protest, but he had already turned around and walked into the bedroom, slamming the door behind him. Her voice came from the hallway, but he wasn't listening anymore. All he heard was the pounding of his own heart and the whispers of betrayal that had now become an integral part of their story. The morning after that scandalous evening began with a tense silence. David woke up earlier than usual and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, not knowing what to do next. His mind was racing between pain, anger, and cold calculation. Sarah was still asleep, curled up under a blanket in the next room, where she had gone the night after he locked the bedroom door. Her peaceful face irritated him. How could she sleep so peacefully when she had ruined everything? He got up slowly, went into the kitchen, and made himself a cup of coffee. The cup in his hands was shaking, and thoughts of how to continue living after everything that had happened haunted him. All David knew was that he wasn't going to take it any further. Sarah appeared in the kitchen doorway towards noon. She looked tired. Her hair was disheveled, and there were remnants of yesterday's despair in her eyes. She tried to smile, but David didn't even look at her. "We had a hard evening," she said, cautiously approaching the table. He silently looked up at her, and then put down the cup. His voice was low but firm. She froze. "What? You heard me. You have to leave," he repeated, getting up. His height and calmness made him even more intimidating. "David, let's talk." Sarah reached out to touch him, but he stepped back. "We have nothing to talk about, Sarah." His eyes burned with anger, but he tried to keep himself in control. "You betrayed me. That's it. This is the end." She pressed her hands to her chest, her voice trembled. "Do you really want to end it all because of one mistake?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "It's not a mistake, Sarah. This is a betrayal. It's a lie. It's an abomination." Her face contorted in pain. She tried to say something, but he raised his hand to stop her. "No, don't start. You knew what you were doing. You've made a choice. Now I'm making mine." Sarah came closer, her voice quieter, almost pleading. "We've been together for so many years, David. You can't just destroy everything. We can get through this if you give me a chance." "A chance?" He chuckled, but there was no warmth in his eyes. "Do you want me to give you a chance after you brought this into my house?" He remembered yesterday's condom and felt a new surge of disgust. She turned away, lowering her head. "I was drunk," she began, but he cut her off abruptly. "It doesn't matter if you were drunk, sober, or passed out. You did it, and now I have to live with it? To look at you every day and think about it? No, Sarah, you're leaving." Her eyes filled with tears, and she turned back to him. "Where should I go? This is my home too, David." "Not anymore. You can take whatever you want," he said icily. "I won't stop you, but you have to leave. Today." She clutched the edge of the table in desperation, as if looking for support. "You don't understand how hard it is for me. It was a moment of weakness, David. I made a mistake, but that doesn't mean that everything is lost. Are you done?" "What is it?" he asked sharply, coming closer. His voice sounded so cold that Sarah shuddered. "If you're done, then take your bags and pack your things. I won't do it again." He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there, struggling with her emotions. David was already thinking about how to simplify the process. He decided that he would start filing for divorce as soon as Sarah left. For the next few hours, Sarah walked around the house, packing her things. She was crying softly, but she didn't let herself make too loud noises. Every time their gazes crossed, she tried to meet his eyes, but David immediately looked away. When she was ready, Sarah stood at the door with 2 suitcases. "That's all," she said softly. He was standing a few steps away with his arms folded across his chest. "Great." She opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something, but changed her mind. David came over and opened the door, gesturing that the conversation was over. "Goodbye, Sarah," he said, not hiding the coldness in his voice. She hesitated for a moment, looked at him, and then went out the door. David closed the door as soon as the suitcases were out of sight. He remained standing in the hallway, looking at the wooden panel, and suddenly felt his whole body clench with anger and pain. He knew that there would be difficult days ahead, but he also knew that he would not back down. Everything that had happened between them was in the past. It's been 6 months since Sarah left their house. At first, he tried not to even think about her. He stopped going to their favorite coffee shop where they used to sit on weekends and threw away everything that reminded him of her. The photos that hung in the bedroom disappeared first. Then her books, left on the table in the living room. Even their shared pasta-making kit, which she adored, was gone, replaced by a new set David had bought on the weekend. But it wasn't just cleaning up. It was an act of purification, a symbol of a new life. David began to spend more time in the office than ever. He threw himself into his work, taking on projects that he would have previously refused because of their complexity or volume. His colleagues also noticed these changes. "Hey, David, you started spending more time here than at home," Mark, his colleague, once joked. David smiled briefly without looking up from the computer screen. "A house is an overrated concept," he replied without taking his eyes off the financial report. However, one day his new rhythm failed. It was late. He was late at the office after a long day of meetings. Everyone left, leaving him alone in a large empty space lit only by a table lamp. There was an almost empty cup of coffee on the table when his gaze accidentally fell on the phone screen. A message from an unknown number. "David, I know you don't want this, but I need to talk. Sarah." His fingers hovered over the keyboard. His heart began to beat faster, but he immediately forced himself to calm down. He put the phone away in his desk drawer without answering. The next day he changed the number. It was the last step in his mission to erase her from his life. Then David moved into a bright loft with huge windows and a minimalistic design. No old things, no memories. Every item, every detail was chosen by him personally. This house became his symbol of freedom. He often stayed at the gym in the evenings now, and then went to the nearest bar, where he invariably ordered the same cocktail. His life became rhythmic and orderly, like a symphony without extra notes. But the loneliness still made itself felt. One evening, after leaving the bar, he noticed a woman in a green dress sitting at the bar. She was laughing, her short dark hair falling over her face. For a moment, he remembered Sarah laughing the same carefree laugh. He wanted to come over, but he stopped himself. "You live in a different way," he thought, returning to his car. As time passed, the past was increasingly erased from memory. Now he started every morning with a jog along the embankment, returned home, turned on music, and cooked breakfast. There were no other voices in the house anymore, only his own thoughts. One day, after finishing his morning ritual, he looked in the mirror. The person looking at him was different, stronger, more confident than the man he was when he stood here with Sarah. And although the future remained uncertain, he knew that he would never allow himself to depend on anyone else again. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.